Do you think the Corvette engineering team at Chevy ever imagined the cars they're designing over 20 years ago would still be on the road here in 2024? And could they have imagined just where Corvette would be just 20 years later? Today, we're pitting the 2001 Corvette against its modern counterpart, this 2024 Corvette, to see just how far technology and build quality have come in the last 2 decades. So I want to start by breaking down probably the most notable difference in these two cars, at least for the owner, is the interior quality. Now, you guys know on the older Corvettes how the interior was really where they cheaped out on. You got a lot of performance for the money, but they did that by spending less money on other spots. The interior is definitely part of that. There are panel gaps here. Nothing fits well together. When the door closes, you can fit your finger in some of these panel gaps, which is truly just a little bit disappointing. Obviously, this has had some modifications to it, so this is not exactly like a bone stock Corvette, but overall, you get the idea that this interior leaves a little bit to be desired. When we talk about interior features, this 2001 Corvette was way ahead of its time. This generation Corvette was designed in the early to mid 90s. The first variant came out in 1997 officially for production. So realistically, this is an early 90s, mid 90s design. And wow, they did a great job. This thing still feels relatively modern even as we enter the 2020s. Of course, we have power windows with the auto down setting. We have our power locks, we have our power mirrors, and we have memory functions. And these remember which key you had, so it automatically goes to whatever memory function for that key was set. HVAC controls were fantastic. Dual zone climate control, pretty cool for its design time. You have very easy to use controls. Everything that you need for the menu is right here. All of your heads-up display controls right on this side. We have our suspension settings and active handling button right here on the center. And we have the world's most useless cup holder. And we have the one thing the C8 Corvette can't match is the manual transmission. Now the interior of the C8 feels like a whole different world, it really does. This is a 3LT model, and because of that, it does have a lot of all the gadgets that you can get. But let's take a look at some of the technology that's in this car. We have a powerful 14-speaker Bose system. We still have our memory settings. On the controls, we have our convertible top and rear window, as well as front windows, power up and down. We have our mirror controls. Not a lot is different there. We've gone past the C5 generation. We've gone to this button release instead of a latch, take it or leave it. We've got our locks, and we've got our front and back trunk release right there. Our HUD is controlled by these dials right here. It is a color HUD. It is far more advanced than the one we have in the C5, but it is still a heads-up display. We have all of our electronic parking brakes, brightness controls. We have these little vents here, and the dash is all digital with this super cool startup animation. We've got the full digital dash here, and it's pretty cool as it will change depending on what mode we're in. Gives us a lot of information. We can customize what's on there, and we can customize the look of it depending on the mode that we're in. Of course, we have our big display here. Our transmission is probably the biggest difference, and we don't have a stick shift option. This is our transmission. No matter which C8 you get, this is your transmission. It is all button. You do have a manual button to allow you to use the flappy paddles here, but that is as manual as you get. There's a mode select wheel right under here. And we have a couple interesting buttons, including one that I've been using a lot, is that front end lift. Polarizingly, our HVAC controls are all on this wall here that separate the passenger accommodations from the driver to let you know clearly who is the most important one in this car. Our mirror is pretty cool. It is actually a camera. So we have a camera mirror, and when the top is down, it reverts to a normal mirror. This does create some issues I'll tell you about later, but it's a pretty cool feature. And of course, we have a little bit more buttons. We have OnStar, and we've got our HomeLink controls right up there. The steering wheel itself is this Squircle steering wheel. The Alcantara wrap, the microfiber suede, is an option that this car has, and the stitching is about like you'd expect from Corvette. It's not the highest quality, it's not the lowest, it is adequate. Our steering wheel has a lot more buttons. We have our flappy paddles, we have all of our cruise control buttons right in front, we have our collision avoidance based on camera, not radar on this. We have a customizable drive mode button, we have some radio controlled back there, we have our information center controls, and we have heated steering wheel, and we have voice Bluetooth controls. Our cup holders, while hidden, are actually useful in this car, unlike the C5 cup holders. And we have a wireless charger for a phone right there in the back. Panel gaps are much better in this car. You can't stick your finger in any of them, and overall everything you touch feels much higher quality. One option you did not get in the C5 generation Corvette was a power top. If you've not seen this thing, it is pretty cool, and that's how the convertible works on the C8 Corvette. Trunk space is a little bit disappointing in the C8. Obviously, for the mid-engine platform, they did pretty well and gave you quite a bit for what this chassis is capable of. This rear one does fit a lot. They say 2 bags of golf clubs. I'm not sure how many people play golf with these cars, but that's what it will fit. While our front lifts right up to reveal a pretty deep but small storage area. Now, this is definitely an edge I believe that the older generation Corvettes have, is the overall storage. Although this C8 Corvette has a lot of actual storage by numerical space, it is all split up and makes it hard to store big items. The C8 is also available with the Targa, just like this C5, which really doesn't change a whole lot in terms of operation or structure. So let's talk a little bit about performance and see what these cars have to offer. Along with the 2001 Corvette, the LS1 engine was also unveiled in 1997. And this became kind of the standard in modern architecture for GM engines, and is still a powerhouse leader today. On its initial release, this thing was pumping out right about 350 horsepower and 350 foot-pounds of torque. As opposed to the engine in this C8 Corvette, this is the 6.2 liter LT model engine. It is actually hidden under the top cover in this car, in the convertible. You can see it in the base coupe. It is clearly visible. You can get dress-up packages, but in the convertible, it's kind of hidden. This thing is putting out 490 horsepower, 495 with his Z51 package. So definitely a more potent engine, but after 20 years, we're only gaining roughly 100, 150 horsepower, and this thing has gained a little bit of weight as well, sitting in at about 3,500 pounds for the C8, as opposed to about 3,100 pounds for the C5. So let's talk about the overall driving experience of this car. The C8 is fantastic. I'll say that point blank, it is an awesome car. This is not the Z51 car, this is just the base Stingray, and here's what I can tell you. The steering wheel is very light, very responsive. It changes a little bit how responsive it is depending on what mode it's in. You don't really feel a whole lot on what the tires are doing, and that was a big criticism I've seen on a lot of reviews. It's really hard to feel exactly when the tires are gripping, when they're not, but the tires are really good at gripping, so that's not a big issue. One thing that is easy to feel is the overall chassis. This is a very stiff car, the chassis is very stiff, and you can kind of feel what the overall vehicle is doing. It's not like it twists or walks on you. It is very smooth, and the chassis transmits very easily what it's doing, how it's rotating, and what it wants to do, which is a pretty cool feature. Now, the suspension, that's a whole different story. This base Stingray is basically what I'd call an awesome GT car. It is super comfortable. It handles bumps really well. It is overall responsive to steering and acceleration, but you do notice some body roll with it. And on a racetrack, it's a little limiting when you're really pushing it. As far as the gauges and information, this thing gives you a lot of information, which is pretty awesome. And it's pretty damn quick. This thing is a dream to drive. It is a lot of fun. It handles pretty predictably. You can just point it somewhere and it gets it there. It doesn't really push like the older generation's Corvettes did, in my opinion. The back end feels pretty planted. Obviously your whole engine and transmission's back there instead of being split like previous cars. But it's a really nice place to be. This car has its own 0 to 60 timer. Just did launch control, manual shifting, and I got a 0 to 60 unprepped surface, fairly cold tires at 3 seconds flat. That's something my C5 definitely can't do. There's a lot to do with the gearing. This is an 8-speed transmission as opposed to the 6-speed in the C5. This has a lot more weight over the rear tires to keep traction loss to a minimum, and overall, the additional horsepower, it just helps. When it comes to driving tech, obviously you have the advanced stability control, traction control, stuff like that. The C5 was the first generation with the active handling system. Obviously over 20 years that has been refined and refined. This thing has more sensors, temperature sensors, and all sorts of things that carry on that C5 technology to this level, and it's purely impressive. This also, of course, comes with creature comfort things like cameras. You get front and rear cameras with this. Backup camera as standard. And for those of you that know my C5 Corvette personally, I've added the backup camera, which has made that car so much more usable. This has front cameras as well, so you see where the front splitter is. And this also has the front end lift, so it will lift up that front end about 2 inches to make sure you don't scrape it on things. Hopefully, if you have one of those expensive splitters down there, these carbon fiber pieces, you don't have to worry about breaking it. So variable displacement, so this will shift down to a V4 if power doesn't demand it. It's got an 8-speed transmission, dual clutch, which requires a little bit more maintenance than the old ones did, but gives you a little bit closer gear ratio for better acceleration. Z51 package obviously tightens that up a little bit and gives you a slightly shorter ratio, limiting your overall top speed, but getting you there a little bit quicker. And as I found in this car, supposedly this will have the bigger top speed since it's not the Z51, but after about 120 miles an hour, it was very slow to want to continue. So really, I don't think that's a big deal. I think the Z51 is probably the ideal gear ratio for this car, even though it does lower the fuel mileage. C5 generation, rated for 16 city, 30 highway. The C8 generation, 16 city, just the same, but only 25 highway. Without the Z51, it was, I think, 26 or 27, is a little bit higher, but they adjusted the EPA because everybody bought the Z51 cars. That is what it is. So I guess my overall takeaways are that I like this car. Corvette made a car that is easy to drive fast. And I'll say that again, it is easy to drive fast. The C5, plenty fast, 175 mile an hour top speed, and just an incredible platform that they revised and built upon for generations, C6 and C7, all the way up to 2019 from 1997. The platform is good. There's nothing wrong with the C5 platform. But you feel things and you have to work for it. It requires you to do more to get more out of it. And some people will like that, and that's fine. I like that. But for the majority of people, I think the C8 that offers all the same performance, more performance even, with a much lower barrier to entry, it is much easier to get in this car and just do these things. That's what makes the C8 stand out, and ultimately what makes the C8 the kind of still desirable years after introduction cars that it is today, excluding the Z06, the E-Ray, ZR1, and the Zora. Just the base C8 is just incredible. It just is. It's incredible. If you guys have been following the markets, these things are now selling well under $70,000 for the used ones. The new ones are even being sold under MSRP, which is kind of cool. But the used ones, under $70,000 all day long, you can find these. On the right day, you can find some decent under $60,000 models. I think that's pretty impressive. So back in the 2001 Corvette, and just putting the key in the ignition is definitely a more antiquated process, without a doubt. The engine makes a little bit more noise, there's some more squeaks and rattles, and that's more due to age than it really is technology. Now, one thing I noticed with the 2024 Corvette is something simple like the mirror. The rear view mirror on it has the camera system built in, which is pretty cool. Nice bit of technology, but that camera turns off when the top is down, obviously because it's hidden, so that it becomes a normal mirror, which means the mirror has to be capable of being reflective in addition to the camera thing behind it, the screen. So when you're driving during top up times, especially if it's bright, you'll see the screen, you'll see what's behind you, but you'll also see that reflection, and they're on two different focal planes, and they're kind of distracting and a little bit disorienting. So I'm not sure that technology is fully worked out yet. It either needs to be fully reflective or not reflective, or have something that totally changes it, because that makes it a little bit hard to see, at least in the convertible models. Well, you're plenty able to get this 2001 Corvette to go fast, especially compared to anything else on the road, most modern commuter cars, compared to most speed limits. 2001 Corvette will be plenty fast. Never a problem with that. The thing is, you can really tell that you're going fast in this. It takes a little bit more effort to get in the right gear, to get it to go, and the chassis itself gives you a little bit more feedback that you're beginning to go that fast. It's kind of cool. Now, after I get a little heat in these tires, one thing I'll try and do is do a 0 to 60 for you guys, timed on camera here. The best I was able to get out of that 2024 Corvette was 3 seconds even, 3.0 seconds. That was my best 0 to 60 with launch control, and that was repeatable. I could do that time after time, but that was the best I was able to get on the Pilot 4 all-season tires that it had on it, and just the way the car was set up, that was it. This car is definitely longer. Most online forums will tell you it's somewhere right around 5 seconds, just under 4.9 for the manual transmission, depending on your shifts. And with a little extra power, you might be able to shave off a tiny bit from that, but in the ballpark of 5 seconds. Right away, one thing I'm noticing is the noise. This big hoop here makes a lot of noise, and I'm sure the new Corvette, the C8 generation with the target top, you're going to get more noise than the convertible as well, but back to back driving them, it is readily apparent. Overall, the chassis dynamics are pretty similar. Now, the C5 generation Corvette had a steel frame, the hydroform steel chassis, and that was at its time pretty revolutionary. It kept it pretty stiff. It's got the torque tube, very stiff chassis, but compared to the C8 is aluminum and it is super rigid. The chassis itself doesn't flex at all. The way the cars communicate are actually pretty similar. You can tell the weight bias is slightly to the rear in the new Corvette as opposed to slightly forward in the old Corvette. in driving them and pushing them hard, they drive about the same. There's not a big difference, which I think is pretty cool. And there's something about the active handling system in this car that is a little bit more permissible than, say, the active handling system in the C8. Even in sport mode in the C8, the traction control wouldn't let me spin the wheels for more than a second, really not getting any slide whatsoever. The active handling system in this 2001 Corvette actually lets you get a little bit sideways, even in regular mode, without going into performance driving mode, which is kind of cool. It lets you kind of get stepped out just a little bit, enough to have fun, but without overdoing it. I think the way they've managed that is pretty darn impressive. The brakes are worth mentioning in a big way. Now, I've never said that the C5 Corvette is lacking in the brakes department. I think it's fine for the chassis, and they do really well. The thing about the C8 is that the brakes are actually brake-by-wire. There's no connection between your foot pedal and the actual hydraulic system of the brakes. It's all electronic, which allows you, depending on mode, to be a little bit more sensitive than others. Kind of cool. It is a little bit touchy and takes some getting used to, as opposed to this very normal hydraulic system on the C5 Corvette. So at this point in time, it takes a little bit to keep these older cars running. These things are at least 20 years old. 2004 is the last year of these. So it's at least 20 years old if you're getting a C5. And the way things break down, at minimum, it's going to require a little bit of work to get them back to like new condition. That said, I think it's going to perpetually be easier to keep something like the C5 up to that condition than it will a mid-engine car like the C8. Now, looking underneath it, once you take the covers off, it's still not that difficult to work on a lot of the C8 stuff, but it does require a little bit more effort than the exposed engine and exposed setup like the C5 has. So I guess my driving takeaways are the C8 is a little bit numb to the user. It's all electronic. It changes depending on modes. It's a little bit non-communicative as to what your control inputs are doing. That said, the chassis is super stiff, and you do get a pretty good feel about what the car itself is doing, what physics is making the car do. You can feel that pretty well. The C5, you can absolutely feel everything about this car. There's a little bit of flex that I feel with the chassis, and I think a lot of that is due to a lot of the worn rubber bushings and joints that this thing has, flexing a little bit more than they did initially. But you can feel a little bit more flex maybe than this car than you could the C8. But the hydraulic steering, the direct connection to the gas and the brakes, all that stuff makes it feel what wheels are braking traction, what the car is doing, and how you're driving it. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it is certainly easy to make the C8 go fast. But if you put them back to back on a racetrack in perfect condition with everything working the way they were supposed to, it may be more fun driving the C5. Every time I drive the 2001 Corvette, I'm wondering what's going to break next, which is not a problem I had with the C8. I know there's some build quality issues. The C8 is still a Corvette. They still cut corners a little bit, but I can tell you for sure I am not worried in the way that I am with the C5 about going out of town on a trip and something happening. So in summary, the 2001 Corvette was built by a bunch of passionate people at General Motors who, in secret, at least in the beginning, took the C4 generation and pushed it further and developed this platform that was absolutely outstanding. They used it for 3 generations. C5, C6, and C7, largely based on the architecture and the groundwork laid in the C5. Now, 20 years later, at minimum, these things are still on the road. There's still a lot of them on the road, and these things are still super popular. As of the last couple of years, you can get these things as low as $10,000 in good condition, and really, there's not anything else out there that gives you this performance value and still has the aftermarket support and parts support that this car does. That comes in contrast to the 2024 Corvette, the C8 generation starting in 2020, that GM gave the full green light to go ahead and build the performance car the Corvette has always been meant to be. There's no leaf springs on it. It is truly modern in just about every way and a rival to all the European counterparts out there. Will we see the 8th generation Corvette still on the road 20 years in the future? Although the technology has advanced quite a bit, I want to say yes. They have sold a ton of these things, more than the C5s for sure, and the chances of those things still being on the road in 20 years, I think, is super high. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Which one do you think is going to last longer? Which one do you think is the better car? If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and like this video if you want more content like this. And as always, we'll see you next time.